Back in the 18th century, Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote a book called Reveries of the Solitary Walker. Of course, you could still write a book with that title today, but you'd struggle to be solitary because there are people cycling, running, having conversations which would have been private on their mobile phones, people making YouTube videos and so on. And the lack of space, even on a weekday in the city, is really quite oppressive. The best thing to be in a city, of course, is a stranger. Hi and welcome to Outlaw Bookseller, and as you know, a certain amount of loose decadence is de rigueur on this channel, and we're reviewing today, looking at some of my recent reads and discovering the pleasure or displeasure of the text. Now, I'm thinking, who is the pleasure of the text by? Is it Roland Barthes? I think it is. I'll flash it up on the screen and you can look at it for yourself. So I've read quite a lot recently, and that's good because sometimes, you know, you sort of, we were discussing this in work the other day with me and the chaps, and you sometimes find that you zip through things, and other times that you hit something and it sort of trips you over and it doesn't go well. But recently I've been really going for it, which is great. So now it's early in the morning. I'm in a different location, as you can see. I'm in the kitchen, and recently the video editor has been throwing out lots of stuff, which is good. But as you see, I'm surrounded by chintz and textiles and stuff like that. What does it all mean? And I don't know about you, but this really bedevils my life. I love it dearly, and you know, it's great to have ladies around when you're a heterosexual male, as I am, and many of you are as well. Of course, if you're not, that's not a problem. But they do have this tendency, I find, and yes, we're descending into stereotypes, to have lots of materials, you know, whereas us guys, we like to collect stuff. And I'm hoping at some point to get a friend of mine to talk with me about the difference between male and female collectors. It's really interesting, but I've got to sort of speak to her, and I'd like to get her partner involved as well, because they're both big booky people, but we'll see. Anyway, reviews. What have I been reading? We're going to start with a few, what does Scott Bradfield call it? Durs and not so durs. So first of all, a dur, and this is The Universe Against Her by James H. Schmitz, who I know the chaps have been really enjoying. By the chaps, I mean the guys over in the good old North American continent. Matt Defoe at Science Fiction Reads has had a massive James Schmitz thing going on. He's done sub-videos and he's really into it, and I love Matt. He's a great guy. Hey Matt, hope you're watching. And also Richard Remble at Vintage SF, to have a Canadian contingent. They're such nice people, aren't they, the Canadians? I love them. David Cronenberg, of course, is Canadian, my favourite filmmaker. And I think that Ira at SF Words of Wonder has been reading these as well. Forgive me if I'm wrong, but it seems like everybody's reading them. And this, as you see, has one of the worst covers in the known universe. Now, you may well think it's a good cover, and it does depict something that goes on inside. And this is the first of the Talsy Amberden books. And she's basically a telepathic mutant, and is set in this future history, the Hub Federation universe. If you want to know more about it, do watch Matt's videos, because they're really good, and Matt's always a joy. And I've had this for a while, and I've got the others. There's 3 of them, and then there are sort of adjunct stories. And they were basically all short stories in analogue, mostly, in the 60s. And then they were fixed up into books. And there's no hardcover of this. And recently, you might have seen that I bought hardcover editions of the second and third ones in the sequence. And I must say, I started to read this, and I expected it to be light and fun and not that demanding. But I have to say, it really, really annoyed me. I really don't like the writing. It stumbles over itself. It's clunky. It's just, for when this is like early 60s, and I just didn't think much of it at all. And I don't want to spend too much time on it because I don't want to upset the guys, because I know they've enjoyed these, and maybe this is the wrong one. The Lion Game I have higher hopes for, and you know, it's weird. I was book shopping yesterday. I said I was book shopping. I was in Marlborough, which is about 30 miles from here in Wiltshire, a very nice little town. And I was in the Oxfam there, and they had a load of issues of analogue from the 60s and 70s, and I leafed through them, And I look at the analogue writers, and they're never people I'm very excited about. And there were loads of James H. Schmidts. So there we go. It just doesn't flow. I mean, the sort of lack of real style or anything. And you know, I just feel he needed a good dictionary of synonyms and antonyms beside it when he read it. So passing on that one, I'm hoping that the later ones have a little bit more literary facility, shall we say. So that was a no-no. Something else that was a duh. Last night I was flicking through YouTube on the old smart TV, and I came across one of my videos, and it was one I did over a year ago about the Strugatsky brothers, about How to Be a God, Roadside Picnic, and other books as well. And it was really sort of a roundup so you could see what was out there, because there's now more Strugatsky books in print than in English than there ever have been. And funnily enough, I had recently gone back to this book, Monday Starts on Saturday, presented during Golank's Masterwork, and I showed it in this previous video, and I had read it before, and I felt that I hadn't got as much out of it as I should have, and I went back to it. And I have to say, I do feel it is time to slaughter the Strugatskys as sacred cows, because everyone's very reverent about them because of Roadside Picnic. And I'm beginning to formulate a theory about them, which is that I think the reason why the Strugatskys rose to prominence and have increasingly rose to prominence is because of the film of Stalker. And obviously that was a long time ago, and they were in print in Britain and America as far back as the late 60s and throughout the 70s. But really, most people's first encounter with the Strugatskys is usually the Tarkovsky film of Stalker, of Roadside Picnic. And it's a big sort of sprawling art house epic, and it is great. And I remember first seeing it way back and enjoying it, despite the fact that it is occasionally very ponderous. But I think people are almost afraid to sort of say anything bad about the Strugatskys. And I'm going to talk about this a bit. Now, you'll notice that it's called Monday Starts on Saturday. Now, in my old video, I called it Monday Begins on Saturday. Now, it's an interesting thing. When you read an awful lot, you will often skip read something, and your consciousness inserts words because you know the rules of grammar and how things work. And I inserted begins because begins is far more euphonious and fitting than starts. Monday starts on Saturday. Monday begins on Saturday. Begins is more literary, more flowing, more portentous. Starts is a little bit workaday and practical. So I'd always read this as Monday begins on Saturday. Now, interestingly enough, this Doe edition, which I bought from Dorset Bob for a pretty penny or two recently, is called Monday Begins on Saturday. Okay, so take a look at that nice little A format, compare the two together, there you go. And I think this is going to tie into something I'm going to say about Cezanne Liu when I do a video actually devoted to the three-body problem. That is coming up. But I decided to go back to this, and I have to say that as much as I love the first third of it, and it's a tripartite book, it has three main parts, I really dislike a lot of it. That's down to the fact that there's a thread in Russian SF that has been there since before science fiction was called science fiction, which refers to Russian folktales and fabular forms, to fables, and it references them a lot. And this goes way back to Bulgakov, before that, and this sort of tying in of these two things together with the kind of tendency that comes from writers like Gogol and Saltykov-Shchedrin to have these rollicking knockabout conversations about the meaning of life or not between different characters does sometimes really irritate me. Now, I've read lots of Russian novels from the late 19th and early 20th century. It is one of my things. Admittedly, not for a long time. But they are quite dialogue heavy, and often the characters just seem to be quipping and making fun all the time. And it does get a bit irksome, and I found this is very much the case of this. Now, if you don't know the story of this, I'm going to hold up the A format because it's nicer. The basic idea is that this young chap, Sasha, is driving along the road, and he's going to meet some chums, and it's near the sort of Finnish border, I believe. I can't remember the exact details. And he picks up a couple of hitchhikers, and they get chatting. And it turns out that Sasha is a computer scientist. This was written in the 60s, when of course computers are the size of houses. And basically, these two chaps say, you know, come and work with us. You know, we've got an interesting job going on. And the problem with this book is that to understand entirely what's going on, you have to read the blurb on the back of the book, which info dumps what's going on. The Strugatskys never tell you directly. You have to sort of infer it, and that's okay. You know, parsing things is all right. But it's very much a case of there's a lot of show and possibly not enough tell in this book. And anyway, he goes to work with these two guys in this strange town, which reminded me in some ways of a Western town. And he spends some time there. He stays overnight in this bizarre cabin, which has the legs of a chicken. And that's a reference to Pushkin, apparently, to Baba Yaga. And there are all these things from Russian folk tales. There's a cat that talks that seems to be quite wise. There's a coin that when you spend it, you spend the coin in a shop in the town, it ends up back in your pocket. And he does that many times. And he goes to work for this institute, which is basically a Soviet research station looking at the black magic, thaumaturgy, and basically the occult and how it works. And very little is explained, and it's kind of thrown together. And you get all sorts of knockabout characters. And say for the first third, I really enjoyed it. But I remember struggling with it before. And I found it very, very irksome. And they have two modes, the Strugatskys. They have this mode. This sort of mode also comes up to a degree in Snail on the Slope, which I really don't like. And then they have their more straight-ahead mode, which is in things like Hard to Be a God, Prisoners of Power, aka The Inhabited Island, and in Roadside Picnic, and it's much, much better. So when they drop a lot of this fabulous stuff and stuff that's trying to be too clever and get more to the point, I think they create better SF, and it's also much more readable. I do think a lot is lost in translation, probably, and I'm just going to look at the translator of this one now, because I think it might be, yeah, this is a different translation to the Door one. And the Door one, which goes back to the 70s, it says that it's strictly unauthorized translation. So I'm going to read that and see that it is translated by a Russian, and he makes this little foreword where he talks about the folk roots of it. But the best thing about this edition, which I'm going to keep because I love that cover, is the wonderful introduction by Adam Roberts. And Adam says that very often this novel, he loves this novel, he says it should be better known. And it reminded me of probably Roberts' most experimental book, which is the historical novel, which I can't remember the title of. I'll flash it up. I have read it. And it's probably his most Joycean and most advanced novel in a literary sense, but not essentially his most successful one. And what Adam says is that this is about magic, and that in so many books about magic, which are supposedly fantasy, there's a system, and he says often it's been compared to, say, Harry Potter, because they have wands. They don't call them that. I don't think what they call them in this. And also Terry Pratchett, because it's knockabout and there's silly things and satirical things. But of course, if you put the average Rowling or Pratchett fan onto this, they'd collapse in a heap. They wouldn't last 10 minutes. And there is lots of clever stuff in it. And if you know about the esoteric arts, which I do up to an extent because I've read a fair whack, you get a lot of the references. There's a lot of mythological things. There's lots of other things you won't get. But let me put it this way. If this was written by Borges, it would have been a lot better and a lot more clear and more flowing and better as a work of literature. But then again, South America and Russia, two different things. But Adam writes about how that true magic wouldn't have a system because it would be irrational and fantastic and wouldn't apply to scientific rules. And here we come on to the interesting thing about science fantasy. And there is a video coming up on the channel soon about science fantasy, which I'm going to talk about because nobody uses that terminology much. And I remember when it was used a lot. And the whole thing that really, if it's got a system which you can work out, then there isn't really magic. It's not really supernatural, it's natural. And this is what I'm always saying about the difference between SF and fantasy. But it is absolutely brilliant introduction, so I'm going to keep it for that. And I am going to try this, so that'll be my third read. I don't know when I'm going to do it, but I'll report back. I might do it quite soon because I'm quite keen to see what a Russian translator makes fit. The translator of this is obviously somebody from the Anglophone world. So that was not such a thing happening. So I do think it's time maybe to look at the Strugatskys legacy overall and possibly deconstruct some of it. I'll move on now to a book which I have ambiguous feelings about. And this is Skein Island by Elia Whiteley in Titan Books. And Elia Whiteley is a British female SF author. I think she's around about 50, maybe a little bit older, maybe a bit younger. Never met her. And she is chummy with my friend Nina Allen. And she's been publishing stuff for about, let me see, it must be coming to about 20 years now. Several novels, short stories. And I read one of her novels about a year and a half ago, and it was reviewed in my video, which I called Contemporary SF Reviews. And it was very well written, but I wasn't a big fan of it. I can't think of the title is. I'll flash it up on the screen. and she's had a new novel out recently, and I asked Solaris if I could have a free copy, and they never replied. So I thought, well, you know, charming. But fair enough, maybe they'd given all their free copies away. And to think all I've done for Solaris. But we had this sitting on the shelf in work, and it sat there for 2 years and nobody bought it. And I kept looking at it, and I decided to pick it up. Now, this, I would say, is actually a fantasy novel rather than an SF novel. It's very original, and yet at the same time, it does tie in with a thread in which mythology has come back into general fiction and become a bit of a thing commercially, especially for female writers in the UK. But at the same time, it's stunningly original. So it's really good. So it does make you think about the thing of when you take things from mythology or folk roots, rather like the Strugatsky things, to sort of make it fresh and yet still relevant is really good, because I think one of the big problems is, I mean, the big book which caused the surge in female writers retelling Greek myths and foregrounding the female characters in feminist takes. That's been happening a heck of a lot, and it's almost a guaranteed route to a bestseller. And of course, a lot of it is just really averagely written. That was started by Madeline Miller with her book about Achilles, and then she did Circe a few years ago, which have been huge, and which are apparently very good. I really can't look at them. I'd rather stick with Robert Graves, Lansing Green, Mary Renault, you know, the proper sort of classically educated people. And one or two of the people who have done these things are. But this is really interesting because, of course, Skeins makes you think of the fates, you know, weaving the sort of destinies of men. And that is fundamentally what this is about. So it's about a young woman who is called Marianne. And Marianne works in a library in Wootton Bassett near Swindon. Now, Wootton Bassett is no distance from here. I've never walked around there. I've been through there in the car. And she is on the late shift one night, and she's shutting down on her own. And this man comes in, and he threatens her with sexual assault, but it doesn't actually happen. But she's very shaken up by it, and she tells the police. She goes home with her partner David, and I would say that the characters are really nicely drawn and very sympathetic throughout. All the characters are sympathetic, which I really liked. And she is a bit traumatized, but she's sort of come through it. But she goes off to this retreat to a place called Skeins Island, which since 1945 has been a private refuge for women. And it was set up by a woman called Lady Amelia Worthington, who back in the day, back in the early part of the century, was a rich socialite, knew everybody. She had friendships with people in the Nazi party, with a Leicester Crowley who always pops up in these sort of things. And she set up this feminist sort of place where people could go and they could, you know, spend a week meditating, and what men are not allowed on this island, and it's off the coast of Devon. So Marianne goes off to that, and meanwhile David stays at home, and he's disheartened and unhappy about what's happened to Marianne, and he decides to stake up the library one night, and he gets caught there by a female cop called Samantha. And this may be a spoiler, but I'm not going to give you too many. But David and Samantha develop a relationship. And the way that Whiteley describes this is beautifully done and very subtle and deft. And I really, even though there was a thing where David and Marianne were partners, they're obviously drifting apart. And David's having issues, and Samantha is really depicted really beautifully, and their relationship flowers. But over on Skeins Island, Marianne is meeting other women there and discovering a strange truth about a statue in a basement in the house on Skeins Island, which will have incredible implications for the relationships between men and women. I don't really want to say any more about than that, but it is stunningly original. It refers to Homer, and it refers to the Fates, who of course spin men's destinies. And was it a feminist book? To a sense, yes, but there was nothing unsympathetic about the male characters. And there's one very clever thing where David goes to a local pub where there's a character called Arnie, and Arnie's relationship to the rest of the characters isn't immediately obvious, and then it comes up, and it's really, really good. It's kind of a Preistian thing. And also there's a strange thing about a game involving 4 coloured cubes, red, blue, yellow and green, and that mirrors something that's happening on Skeins Island. And I really enjoy this. I would urge you to read it. My problem with the book, and it was a big problem, is that it doesn't really have great visual descriptive sense. And I felt that had this book had that, it would have been much better. And it would have been a more engaging and interesting read, because I did find the prose somewhat bland. It's not badly written, it's very well written, but it's not that flavoursome, and that was a big problem. And something at the moment is a lot of writers seem to be very, very afraid of too much physical description of individuals or places. And I can see why. I mean, a lot of creative writing courses, they'll say, you'll end up like a 19th century novel with 2 pages about the weather before you start. It could also have been that she was trying to avoid the more obvious gothic tinges this could have had. But quite frankly, I think it needed them. So it felt rather underwritten to my way of thinking. But I would say check it out. Am I going to read more by Elia Whiteley? My initial thought about this was that when I finished it, that I wouldn't read anymore. There is also a little novella at the end which shows the return to Skeins Island. But she has got something, and this is an early book, and the other book I read by her was more recent, and that was a little bit more colourful and textured and stylistic than this one. But this does have some really good ideas in it. So it is a fantasy novel. It's not a sword and sorcery novel. It's a refreshing change to these feminist retellings of famous Greek myths and things. And of course, the female characters are always there. And the argument is that they're always like the antithesis of the men. They're there to frame the men's narratives. But I think the truth is, when you read a lot of Greek myths, is that they're often very powerful, and maybe they're reacting to men, but you are talking about the classical world, which was often very violent. There's often a lot of war, and men obviously did oppress women because it was testosterone fueled. But there is more to these debates and things. But I would say I actually enjoy it. The more I think about it, the more I feel that it was a worthy read. It was more like a sort of 6 out of 10 when it could have been an 8 if the writing had been more interesting. So I am going to give her one more go at some point. I can't say I'm going to read yet, but we'll see. So I went from ambiguous to warming to it. Do we have anything else to talk about here? I don't know if we do. I think we need to move somewhere else, really. And now for something completely different. Well, it's not. It's probably much more of the same. I just felt the need to sort of be upright rather than slouching and bring myself around. I had one too many lagers last night, which means I had one last night in my terrible state. And I decided to revisit this book, let me see if I can get this right. Joan Slonczewski, A Door into Ocean, and this is a horrible print-on-demand Amazon edition from Phoenix Pig. How I hate print-on-demand much of the time, though there are good ones like Leaky Boot Press. But this, I used to have a really, really nice Tor trade paperback of this, and I got rid of it, wish I kept it, but I felt the need to get it back in the library and give it another go, so I'm just going to pop it there. This was once published in the UK by Women's Press in the late 80s in a B format. That's quite uncommon. And I would like that one or the Tor one. And they see them online, but often they're stock pictures and it's World of Books, that sort of thing. So you're not going to get something great. But I decided to look back at it. And it's a book which had quite a lot of praise, when it first appeared back in 1986. And I bought it because it was in Broderick and DeFilippo's book, 101 Best Science Fiction Novels, 1986 to 2012, I think is the period they cover. They try and sort of do a sequel to David Pringle's book, which is 1948 to 1984, which is a fantastic book. And it was one of the books I picked up out of that because I remembered it at the time, but never got around to reading it. And it was rather hamstrung by appearing in the Women's Press SF line. For as I've said in other videos, they weren't fantastic sellers because they had this very austere grey livery, when probably a more traditional genre representation approach would have snuck more of the books under the radar of the average sort of fan, And this is a book which won the John W. Campbell Award, so that's interesting. The basic idea is that you've got a universe where there's been mass planetary colonization by human beings who are called primes, and a lot of their technology has been forgotten, and it's left a debased and vaguely militarized galactic empire type federation of planets sort of behind it. Now the novel is set on a planet which is orbited by a large moon which is entirely covered by an ocean. So of course This immediately smacks of Ursula Le Guin's Hainish sequence in general, and specifically the Dispossessed, which has that dual body system with ideologically opposed political systems to examine their respective ideologies. Now, Strugatskys does the same thing, so you could call it a homage, but instead of opposing Zen-like anarchism with free market enterprise, she sets up a female-only empathic civilization against a more trade-based capitalist one. Now, to the reader who's read Ursula Le Guin, the similarities are really difficult to ignore, and so comparisons are inevitable, and they're highly relevant, because Strugatskys really did fail to bring me round to her way of thinking, whereas with Le Guin, she presented me with very powerful food for thought. And even though I regard Le Guin as the most important female author of modern and contemporary SF, her influence is possibly rather too great on other female SF writers who've emerged since her. And one notable exception to this is the massively underrated Lee Kennedy, who manages to be both sensitive and visceral. And she falls somewhere in between Le Guin, Susie McKee-Charnas and Angela Carter. And sadly, Lee has produced a small body of work. She has unpublished novels. I'm going to talk about on the channel again. I have discussed it once briefly when I reviewed a book called The Journal of Nicholas the American, which I think is a fantastic novel. Going back to Door into Ocean, aside from positing a civilization which doesn't include men, now you could say this is sexist, but it's SF, so it's a valid conceit. But, you know, it has to be said, there are an awful lot of these exclusionist narratives where, you know, maybe I'm not a woman, I can't say, maybe male oppression really was and is that bad, where female SF writers, when they started to emerge big time as feminists in the 60s and 70s, they felt this was the only way they could cope with men, was to exclude them completely, which is almost kind of sort of defeatism and unrealistic sort of thing, isn't it? But anyway, I found that her society of biologically enhanced sisters, mothers, and love sharers, as she calls them, are rather smug, colourless, unconvincing, and cod mystical. And of course, Le Guin has that cod mystical thing as well. Overall, they weren't really any more sympathetic than the patriarchal invaders from the Federation, from the planet, who wanted to turn the ocean world into a mining resource, because at the bottom of the ocean it's got lots of minerals. So, you know, the antagonists in the story are clearly morally wrong in an environmentalist sense. There's no doubt about that. But apart from the depiction of one of the more spiky characters of the Ocean Women, who enters into a sexual tryst with a naive young man from the other world, these amphibious ladies left me rather cold, indeed cold-blooded, I guess. You know, having sort of written things myself, I don't subscribe to this notion that characters have to be sympathetic. They don't. And in the part where I talk about Skeins Island, I talk about the sympathetic nature of the characters. They don't have to be this way. But when you're presenting an argument, especially an argument for passive resistance, the author really has to convince the reader by presenting the sort of inner warmth of even alien beings. Where Ursula Le Guin does this very, very competently in the early works, and, you know, majestically in books like The Left Hand of Darkness and Dispossessed, for me, Joan Strugatskys failed to make her ambiguous femmes attractive philosophically. Or it could be I'm just too male for this book. Maybe I'm the wrong market. Now, she's a microbiologist. She wrote textbooks, and she's done lots of other SF. You rarely see her work in the UK. I don't think anything by her, apart from Door into Ocean back in the 80s, was ever published over here. And it's a shame, because I'd like to read more of her work. And she is very inventive biologically, because she's a biological scientist, you know. And the sort of critical coverage of the book does tend to emphasize the soft science work in it, the biology. And it sort of creates the impression when you read some of the critical writing on the book that it's something on the imaginative level of, say, Hothouse by Brian Aldiss. And quite honestly, it's a bit more like the sort of biological inventions you get in farmers' stories, things like the strange relations stories, like Mother and Open to Me, My Sister, those things. And although she's got some really good ideas, it's not really presented colourfully or with an eye for the poetic, which is a shame, because that could have really given the book the impact that's claimed for it. Now, I'm not against feminist SF. In fact, I'm quite interested in it, especially the early stuff, 60s, 70s. I think that was the most livid period. I think the stuff that's happening now is quite lame, a lot of it. But the trouble is with feminism is that it often seems every bit as bad as misogyny to me. Misandry is the equivalent. Misandry is a word you don't hear very much. And I have read some other books in the Women's Press series that were quite frankly utterly man-hating. But the main problem I have with this as a literary one is that Strugatskys fails to match up to the likes of Angela Carter, Samuel R. Delany, be a good analogue as well, and Le Guin, all of whom address gender politics intellectually and viscerally with great skill. Now, although this is a good attempt, it's rather overrated and too long by a good 100 to 150 pages. It lacks the cut and thrust of Russ. It lacks the incisiveness of Susie McKee-Charnas, author of The Vampire Tapestry. I really like Susie's work. I'm going to talk about her at some length on the channel. And the subtle feminism and historical perspective of Chelsea Quinn Yarborough. So this is a book that will appeal to those people who are fixated on the later Le Guin, but it lacks the poetry and sympathy of Le Guin's early and middle period work. So it's worth having a look at, but ultimately I found it unsatisfying. I would like to read more by her because I do think, there's obvious talent there, and she published quite a bit. So it would be nice to come across more of her work, but I think you guys in the States who watch are more likely to find it than me. Now, on to something else. I will say that what I've just recited today is based on a review I wrote some years ago, which I posted online. So I am going to go back to this again and give it another go. So just before somebody says, oh, I found all that on a website. Well, yeah, it was me actually. So there you go. Right, something else. This is a book which I keep looking at, or kept looking at. I'm going to pop it up there if it'll fit. Will it fit? No, it won't fit. So I'll hold it there. This, as you can see, is the Puffin Treasury of Classics. What is he doing with a big children's book, you ask yourself? Now, I bought this secondhand on eBay. This is a book club edition, not the original, and it was £3. The postage was more. And I go to a coffee shop in Bath and they have some books there and they have a copy of this. And every time I go in there, even if I'm with a video, I run over and I pick it up and I read something because it's brilliant. And this came out in the late 90s. It's out of print now. And what I love about this book is that it really pinpoints how great writing can be. Now, I say this is aimed at children. Now, a book like this probably wouldn't get published now because, quite frankly, since the rise of YA as a real category in the UK, I think children's reading is really dumbed down. It's filling that gap between children's books and adult books, but it's actually holding people back as well. And this is full of classic and some modern classic, and by that I mean early 20th century writing, both in fiction and poetry. And it's absolutely wonderful. I'm just going to take the jacket off because it's got laminated boards underneath and it's very slippy. And it's so great because it's fully illustrated throughout, and I'll just pick out some examples. It's a different illustrator for each piece, and there are one or two complete short stories in here, but it's mostly bits from novels, and it's fantastic. So you've got a nice picture there, and an extract from Comus by John Milton, and I'm going to read you some of the poetry in this because this is really fine writing. Sabrina fair, listen where thou art sitting, under the glassy, cool, translucent wave, in twisted braids of lilies knitting. The loose train of thy amber dropping hair, listen for dear honour's sake. Goddess of the silver lake, listen and save. Fantastic, it's really, really good. I'm not much for poetry, but I do like romantic poetry. So you get things like Hans Andersen's fairy tales, but the poetry in this particularly is really good. Peter Pan. If you've never read these books, and I'll admit I've not read some of them, you get a really, really good insight into what the books are like. And it's just absolutely fantastic. There's bits from Treasure Island, Frankenstein, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, Jack London's Call of the Wild, The Jungle Book, Gulliver's Travels, wonderful Michael Foreman illustration for Percy Bysshe Shelley's Ozymandias. And of course, Percy Bysshe Shelley, the husband and paramour of Mary Shelley, actually wrote at least 5% of Frankenstein, the 1818 text, and it's great stuff. So I really love this book, and I think it's enormously enriched my reading pleasure, my desire to go back to classic writing. And even if you never read the whole books, like there's a great section from Tarka the Otter in this, which I've got but I haven't read. Absolutely wonderful stuff. And really, if you read science fiction, you have to read other things as well, because one of the problems of science fiction as a genre has always suffered from is that it's very easy to critique it because so much of it is badly written. And we will mention the three-body problem here. But this is fantastic writing. If you've never read these books, if you're never a big reader as a child, try and pick up a copy and just immerse yourself in the prose and the poetry in it, because it's just great. It really, really is. And as I say, it's got William Blake in it and John Masefield, lots of poems that you know bits of, and it's got Wordsworth's Daffodil poem, which is just wonderful, wonderful. And I am going to do a video, I do some readings from this with some appropriate imagery, because I would like to awaken your souls to romantic poetry, because an understanding of romanticism is really important to understand when the scientific romance flowered and how it clashed with the Industrial Revolution and developed SF. I think that's it for now. So there's a few reviews there, quite mixed. As I say, I am reading quite a lot at the moment. I hope to get to some more. Tonight, I'm going to an Adrian Tchaikovsky signing. I might be doing the Q&A there. Otherwise, I'm just going to rock up. You may see it at the end of this video. You may see it in another. Depends on what I actually get to shoot. But that's it for now. Let me know what you think of those books and what you've been reading. And more to come over the next month, upwards and onwards. Bye for now.